lost here. I've been at this 30 years and I've never seen a gathering like this before in my life. And Don has done something completely unique in setting up this kind of a public session held at such frequent intervals, and at any interval as far as that goes. And of course he is also putting out a newsletter. And if any of you are inclined to think that he's sometimes stretching pretty hard for material, well, it amazes me that he can do this, because he's really put an awful lot of pressure on himself, wanting to have something to report at such frequent intervals, both in writing and in public. And where I come from, you just simply couldn't possibly do it because there's just nowhere near that much going on. We might go 6 months before we hear of anything happening in small British Columbia, which is a good deal bigger than Texas. And when we do hear about it, it probably happened 2 or 3 years ago. I know on one occasion, I was just talking to a lady today where she saw this thing at a place called New Berlin out on a farm. And quite by accident, word got to Dawn within about 48 hours after talking to her. I wish I could have that kind of luck once in a while. But I don't really know what you people would like. I of course, done all my work out on the West Coast. I've taken an opportunity once before, 12 years ago, to take a circuit around the United States. At that time, there were things going on in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Florida, New Mexico, Texas, but didn't really know anything much in Ohio, and I just drove through here. And I just got back here, been here a couple of days, so I really know anything about Ohio. Any consensus what you'd like me to talk about?
John, did you mention it?
Yeah.
Mr. Garfield up in Canton, Ohio. Are you in a rural setting, your home location?
Where I live
Yes.
is it's almost a suburb of the city of Vancouver. It's about 70 miles from the city. It's just a little bit beyond commuting range. It's the tip end of a farm area, but Harrison Hot Springs itself is a summer resort on the lake. And if you go straight north from where I live, you hit the Arctic Ocean after crossing only 4 roads. I'm just on the edge. There's all sorts of people very close, but I'm right on the edge of territory where there's nobody but loggers occasionally and hunters, things like that. But I don't have very much information from my own area. For instance, the only place I've seen good tracks is in California. And I come from, a lot of you have heard the word Sasquatch. And this is an anglicized version of an Indian name for these things. It doesn't have a meaning, it's just a name for these creatures. And this name comes from right this little area where I am. But I didn't start it, I know I got a lot to do with spreading it. And 30 or 40 years, or more than that, 40 or 50 years ago, there were a lot of sightings in this area, which is how I got into it. But there hasn't been very much right in my area in the years that I've been active. So I tend to go where something is happening. And the two very best areas I've been involved with are Northern California, where Roger Patterson took the movie. In fact, I'm directly responsible for him being there to take the movie. And then on some islands away up on the coast of British Columbia, two places approximately 1,500 miles apart.
This is the inland waterway?
Yes, mostly on the outside of it. Have you made that trip?
I haven't, my sister has.
Well, there's a little Indian village called Clem 2 on an island called Swindle Island. was sort of the center of this, where we were getting information was from these Indians. And a close friend of mine, named Bob Titmus, was able to stay up there for 3 years with a boat, checking out on these islands, and also on the inlets on the mainland. But on the mainland there are grizzly bears, and there seems to be a lot less information about this sort of thing where there are grizzlies. They don't get out on the islands. And I only spent 2 months there. I was having to make a living at the time. But this is one of those areas where were all sorts of things happening. It's fairly typical for a period of 4 or 5 years, and then in the last 15 or so years, there's almost no information from around there.
One account I particularly have in mind, I don't recall how the 2 men were delegated. However, this was close to the inland waterway. They were connected somehow with shipping. I don't know whether they were civilian or military, but they came upon, this is as the story goes, and it has appeared in many publications, they came upon a UFO, and more than one, I think possibly 3 beings butchering, if you will, various species of wildlife, including large fish, whales, bears, deer. I'm just wondering if you've heard anything on that story that I'm trying to outline.
No, it's completely unfamiliar to me. And it is, once you get north of the Los Angeles area, there's virtually no information that anybody tries to relate these things to UFOs in our part of the country. Back here, it's quite the opposite. An awful lot of the people, not Don or Mark here, but many of the people in this part of the country are primarily UFO people.
Now,
and they hear these stories in connection with it.
Can I ask you a question? Do you believe in that there is a Sasquatch?
I don't like the word believe.
I mean,
you've
never seen one, have you?
No, I've never seen one. To me, the guy that believes is the guy with a PhD who took one course in primate, mentioned primates in first year, and he knows there couldn't be any such thing.
The reason I asked you that was...
Let me finish.
What is that?
I'm satisfied that they exist on the basis of investigation. I consider that to be by far the simpler explanation than to try to explain all the evidence without the existence of such a creature.
I'm with you. I lived there for a little bit for a while.
Did you? Good for you.
Now, what is some of their human characteristics?
As far as I'm concerned, they walk upright, and that's the end of it.
Well, aren't they kind of family-oriented? They move their whole family when they move?
No. Nearly always we see what's apparently a lone male.
Well, I mean, that's what's seen.
Yeah.
But they don't want to be seen.
Nearly
That's
always
why
the
you
footprints
see
are
sight
alone.
them once, and then you don't see them in that area no more they go. My nephew, he was driving one of those cats when he went back into the wilderness area, when he started the log back in it. You know, they never logged it. They were building a road back there. And after they got back in there, every day they would come back in on the truck and they'd leave their equipment and everything sit there. They'd come back home.
Is this at the time of the original Bigfoot?
Well, this is when they started getting back in the wilderness area.
Well,
There have been lots of sightings and so forth before that, but this is what I'm familiar with.
Well, which drainage was this, do you know? Which creek?
Well, it wasn't too far out of Willow Creek, going back in. You know, it was back in there far enough that they could still come home at night.
I mean, what you just said about them going in week after week and seeing the tracks sounds like the time when Jerry Crew took the original cast that started the whole Bigfoot fuss.
Well, yeah, okay. That's where they got them cats. Where they found their went back in and they found these 55-gallon drums thrown down over the hill. They weren't rolled down, they were thrown down.
Yeah.
Now, he's telling me all about this. And they found these footprints.
These things I've also been
And
told, they were before I was
And
ever
they got
young.
this, they were spaced, you know, and they didn't think nothing of it, you know, because everybody had heard about Sasquatch, you know, and everything, so they.
Well,
they
no,
were
he's
telling
wrong
everybody,
there.
These guys went up there and took these plaster casts of them.
He's wrong in recalling that everybody heard about it. When I was first down there, they just didn't have a clue what it was all about. Like in our country, we knew that the Indians had these stories, but
Yeah,
most
but
people
how long
down there
ago was
didn't. 1957, 58.
that? That's 1959 when I was out
Okay, next year. Well, by that time, the name Sasquatch was known down there, but till I hit that country, they never heard of it.
But here's what it seemed to me like, is as you go into their area, they move. They don't stick around with human habitation. This is why I can't understand why these things can be sighted everywhere around human habitation, unless they were hungry.
Well, you'd have to say that 99% of the time they're being very careful not to be seen, yeah. But obviously there are occasions when one or the other of them just throws caution to the wind. You know, the commonest form of sighting across the whole continent, I've got about 2,000 reports, is just as with other animals, somebody sees one run across the road in front of the car. But the second most common is to see one out your own window, when the things actually are approaching the house. Now, you have to allow, of course, for the fact that a sighting requires two things, a thing to be seen and somebody to see it. So I'm not suggesting that they make a habit of approaching houses, but there are hundreds of millions of people in houses, and whenever one does approach a house, there's a good chance that somebody will see it.
Pardon me, sir. Has anybody ever seen them cross water? Do they swim?
Yes, very well. And again, I'm just repeating what people have said they've seen. They swim underwater very well. And this differentiates them totally from all the other apes. And then this is another instance where they're similar to humans. We can do that too.
I've never heard Don say anything about them swimming underwater. Well, I never asked him if they
I don't have any
ever
reports. I haven't
Anybody
heard
Well,
ever seen them
this
swim?
is mostly from this area up the coast I was talking about, but also in some of the rivers. And a lot of this is Indian information, and they will tell you that they're very strong swimmers. You know,
I got
it's not all from Indian.
I got a question I'd like to ask you, see if you can answer. Me and my wife live on the western side of Ohio. We was at a Boy Scout camp, which is real rough like this earth. There goes 8 prints. They're clear to that corner. It was still smooth snow every place.
They just stop.
Disappeared. Now what happens? How can you make 8 steps and then nothing? And they didn't come back.
How did they start?
Well, you come down a slight hill, little creek, headed to the creek, and then, but he was too first from the creek.
Well, the only way that I could suggest physically is that it backed up in its own step.
He sure done a good job of it.
Yeah.
There wasn't no breakage or anything on the footprints.
No, I've heard of that kind of thing occasionally before, and I don't have any answer for it.
Have you heard of that thing before out west?
Just
Occasionally?
only once have I talked to a man that said that he'd actually seen that and heard of it, and maybe 3 or 4 other times. However, the guy that I was talking to was a guy I knew pretty well, and who was a veterinarian who was worked at a federal primate center, and also was a veterinarian for the great apes in the Seattle Zoo. So I have to take him pretty seriously, and he was really puzzled. You know, I can say, all right, it's possible to do that. You got false feet, you got a helicopter, you get them to lower you down, and they pick you up again. Or I don't move to this at all, but said if you're quite satisfied there are flying saucers, then maybe one pick one up. For a natural explanation, which is the kind I like, I don't have a good one. Yeah.
I recently came in contact with some engineers on the Bonneville watershed projects up in Washington and Oregon.
Right.
And some of the engineers that were up in the more remote areas, oftentimes before Mount St. Helens, had come in contact with either so-called sightings or reports of the Sasquatch. And they said that after the fallout from Mount St. Helens, there has been almost no activity. Nobody has seen anything. None of the engineers have reported anything to the Bonneville authorities about reports. I suppose there still could have been something happening. And two of the theories that they've come up with just on their own was that a lot of the animal species around Mount St. Helens were eradicated after the fallout came down because of the vegetation and all that was destroyed at the same time. And they wondered if possibly they could have been caught in that same climatic situation where they became extinct because of lack of food, or if they could have been a complex enough creature that they would have migrated with a lot of the other animals that felt the buildup of Mount St. Helens before it erupted. And I was just wondering if you have any observations on either of those two theories.
Well, I don't have any way of knowing whether they moved out of there. As to being wiped out in any way, the Mount St. Helens didn't really affect a very big area at all.
Well, that 8 Canyon area that they talked
Well,
about
the
so
8
often.
Canyons is gone.
Yeah, that's that's where the
But then there had been a report of 8 Canyons since 1924. And there have been
Are you
a
familiar?
lot of reports around Mount St. Helens, yes, and down by the Columbia. And there are again now.
What's your opinion of the broader Roger Patterson film and the book footprints that were found in Elk Creek?
I think that Patterson film is entirely genuine. I don't see any way that a couple of basically cowboys, one of them a rodeo rider, another a swamper and a trucker who raises horses, could make a better imitation of an erect ape than Hollywood has been able to make since. Well, they've had 20 years to improve on it and they've never come close. And I've talked to the top executive of the Disney studio, and he said they wouldn't even try it. He said they wanted an effect like that to draw it. But he did send me to the man that was considered at that time the best gorilla imitator in Hollywood. And he actually thought it was a man in a suit, but he thought there were people who were that big, and he just had to put on a skin-tight suit. And the fact is that there are not people that big.
Do you have access to any libraries up in that region?
Oh yeah, lots of them.
Vancouver?
Yeah, Vancouver, Greater Vancouver's got about close to 2 million people.
Yes. Are you aware that Dr. Stanton T. Friedman makes his home in Vancouver?
No, what not?
He's one of the top authority, let's say, in the UFO field. This also includes Bigfoot. He's a lecturer, author, researcher, engineer, scientist, physicist. I don't know what else to put onto his resume, but he has made his home there in Vancouver, and I met the gentleman on a couple of occasions, but if you have any access to libraries, I'm absolutely certain you can hunt up his work and read up on it.
Well, my position is very simple. I feel that there is evidence of an ordinary animal, and that's what I'm looking for. If it's something that arrived with a UFO, I'm not looking for it. I'm only looking for something that if I catch it, I can deal with it. I'm not looking for something that if I catch it, it's going to deal with me.
Yeah, very good, very good.
Pardon me, sir. Now, you've never said that you've never, excuse me, that you've never seen a UFO.
I have never seen a UFO.
Never seen nothing strange while you was out looking for Bigfoot? That,
I saw a red light once, like a tail light, that I discovered there wasn't any road there. That's about it.
What do you think about the glowing eye theory?
Well, again, it's a complication we don't have.
What theory, Don?
Glowing eyes.
Oh,
This is where the eyes appear to glow without anything reflecting from them. We certainly have eyes that reflect light, but back here it's very common for people to say that the eyes glowed when there apparently was no light source to reflect, and usually they're supposed to glow red. I don't know what to make of that. I have no knowledge of any process that would do that.
Leave the area fast.
You are in an enviable position dealing with the Indians.
Not really, because you see, in their culture, there's not the distinction that we have between real and unreal. And they believe they know a great deal about these things, but they'll rattle on with things, for instance, you've got to piss down the gun barrel or you'll never hit one. You know, this sort of thing. This doesn't fit with our frame of reference. Also, I had started out in this, and I've long since realized it was foolish, but I thought that all we needed to do was to present a lot of interesting evidence, and that the trained scientific people who are paid to investigate things would jump on this with great glee. And so I knew that if I gave them Indian stories, I would turn them off right there. And so I never really did go into that. Now I know now that no matter where the stories come from, they're not going to listen. I didn't know it at the time.
One last question to me. Are you documenting any of your findings? Putting it on paper?
Oh yes, yes, I've got a shelf about yay long of loose leaf books of information, which nobody ever looks at. I've got 2,000 file
Don't give
cards,
up.
which
Don't
nobody
give
ever
up.
looks at.
What about the Patterson film? You said you turned on Patterson to the area that he went to?
Oh no, he'd been there before.
Oh, okay.
But the thing is, I was down there at the end of August when we made these casts here, and I called him to tell him that these tracks were there, that he wasn't able to come. And as soon as he was able to get organized, he and his friend Bob Gimlin went down there to see what they could find, and this is when they got the movie. It's about 6 weeks later.
How soon
I
after
don't think he would have been down there that year if it weren't for
the prints?
the call about these tracks.
How soon after the film was made were you able to see it?
A couple of days. What they did, they were financed by Patterson's brother-in-law. And they sent the film to him in Yakima. He took it over to Seattle, and there's always been a little bit of a mystery. We think that it was developed in the Boeing plant by a friend of his. And since the friend wasn't supposed to be doing that, it's always been kept quiet. I was actually at Al Diatley's house before, and the film was there too, and Diatley was looking at it in the basement before Roger got home, before he'd ever seen it. However, Al quite properly wouldn't show it to us until Roger and Bob got back and saw it.
Did they
Or
ever-
saw it the same day.
Yeah.
And they just left the thing lying there on the table, and there were a lot of other films on it. We just put it in the pocket and walked away.
Did they ever
And
figure
they
out?
scratched the heck out of it. They just
Yeah.
ran the original through the projector. We just didn't know how to deal with this kind of thing. And of course, never imagined that it was something wasn't going to happen again in 20 years.
Did they ever figure out what speed the camera was on?
No, according to Roger, the little setting was at 18 frames a second when he looked at it afterwards. And he always took his pictures at 24. But you see, the camera was in the saddlebag, and they were on horseback when they encountered this thing. And his horse spooked and fell. And I suppose because he was a rodeo rider, he was able to get clear without any damage done, but he had quite a scramble to get the camera out of the saddlebag. And so it's probable that it got jarred, something hit the little adjustment and moved it at that time, but nobody can be sure. The reason that that's of some significance is that a specialist in living locomotion in England has said that if it's at one speed, now I've forgotten which is which, but at one speed it's a motion that a human could imitate and at the other speed it isn't. But we'll never know. As far as that goes, we've only got Roger's say-so as to where he found it afterwards.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of, or even seen the one this guy is supposed to have shot? He was an Air Force man out in Wisconsin, somewhere out there. He was by himself hunting.
The one in the ice?
Yeah, the one in ice. Now, it was in an Argosy magazine, the original story. And he kind of, well, he didn't want to say what all his name was because he was still in the Air Force and he didn't want his retirement messed up because he thought that he would get in trouble for killing this thing.
Okay, I've only got an opinion. My opinion is that that's a manufactured cargo exhibit. I have no proof, but that's my opinion. Somebody asked me a while back what I thought of the crippled foot. I lean to that being a manufactured.
Did you ever see the thing in ice?
No, I didn't. Nobody can see it very well.
Our chairman of the UFO club up in Medina now, he saw it years ago, and he says, and it stunk.
Sure, that's the easiest thing.
Of course, you could put something
Put some meat in there.
from any animal in there, the juices, and
That's what really shook me up. The two guys that made a fuss about it, and one of them written a book about it, are academically extremely well qualified. And they made the point that this was the most convincing thing of all, and to me it means nothing. You know, I wanted to fake something. The smell of rotting meat is the easiest thing to fake that you could think of.
now, according to the first story that I've read, this was back in the late 50s or 60s, somewhere in there. When he shot the thing, he was chasing a deer. He had shot a deer and wounded it, and he was following this deer, and then all of a sudden he comes up on two of these, what you call them, Bigfoot. The one was squatting down, drinking the blood out of the deer, and the other one was watching. And when this one that was watching saw him, charged him, and he shot a headshot in the eye and blowed the one eye out.
Well, point one, it doesn't look the least bit like a Sasquatch. If it's real, it's some kind of a subhuman.
Now, the thing that was in the ice, sir, was supposed to have been one that was made in Hollywood, and the guy said he paid $5,000 to get an imitation because people was trying to steal the real one from him.
Well, I know that's what he said. But then if it's possible to make an imitation, that blows the whole case right there. And all you've got left is his story. And he told a number of stories. So where are you? But, you know, as I say, I'm just voicing an opinion. I'm certainly not an expert on whether the thing in the ice is real or not.
You interviewed the gentleman some time ago that supposedly was captured, or
Yes,
something
I knew him very well.
Okay, do you believe that to be authentic? Do you believe he was telling the truth?
There's a lot of problems with the story. But it's very hard not to accept that he actually had these observations. If he didn't, then the whole world's been imitating him ever since, because it all fits. And when he told that story, the public concept of the Sasquatch was of a giant Indian with long hair. This is before the days when men wore their hair long. And you can find illustrations from that time, and I can remember because I grew up in the area where these stories circulated. These were supposed to be Indians with villages and signal fires and all this kind of thing. And this man described what could only be called upright aids. And even though he said that he thought they were some kind of human, nevertheless this is what he described. And one of the things I did was to take this veterinarian from the primate center that I mentioned earlier, and a man who had actually been a medical doctor originally and then a physical anthropologist, who was just at that time completing an atlas of comparative anatomy of man, the chimpanzees, and the type of large monkey. And they questioned this guy all one afternoon. And then we went and had coffee afterwards, and they said, well, you know, if he's not telling the truth, he is an absolute expert in ape anatomy. They said that he literally never stumbled in his descriptions throughout the entire conversation. Now, I'm not suggesting that he was able to supply additional details all afternoon. I mean, it's something that happened 30 years ago. but he never put his foot in it, and he did give some detailed descriptions that aren't in the written story. And these two men were very impressed. Now, and this describing, for instance, things that they could do, like they'd be squatted down with their legs crossed and just rise straight up. Or they'd sit, the young male would sit down resting just on his buttocks, hold his feet with his hand, if I remember correctly. Anyway, just with the muscles in his buttocks, he'd go bouncing along. And, you know, these are things that a layman might well think, well, this couldn't be, but these people that knew their apes very well, they had no problems with them at all. So I'm convinced that he had a remarkable set of observations. Now, the things I have a problem with is his route that he describes as just plain impossible. But the funny thing about that is that there's no reason for him to make a mistake in that. You know, he was a logger and an amateur prospector. He knew that kind of country very well. He told us where he went in, which way he went, and then how he came out and where he arrived at. And the thing would have to carry him over about 5 mountain ranges in the course of a half a night, which is something that I can't imagine even these things doing. And also, at one point he says he could see Mount Baker. Well, Mount Baker is the most northern of the chain of volcanoes that Mount Shasta, Mount St. Helens, and so on are in. And it is much bigger than any other mountain in that part of the world. But there's no way he could have seen it from where he was. On the other hand, if he thought he saw Mount Baker, I mean, it doesn't really affect the credibility of the story. He just made a mistake in his mouth. So, but there's this kind of problem. Plus, of course, the story about that the thing swiped a box of snuff and made itself sick. And this is the adult male that carried him off. And I forgot, probably some of you don't know the basic story. He was out on a prospecting trip, and one night this thing just picked up his sleeping bag with him in it, picked up his pack with the other hand, and just carted the two of them off and dumped them down in a little box canyon way up in the mountains, where there was also an adult female and a juvenile male and female. There was just one easy way out, and the old male always stayed between him and the exit, and didn't actually threaten him, but indicated he wasn't to go that way. So he went and set up his camp up at a spring up at the other end of this little canyon. Wasn't really all that near to where they were most of the time, but the young male particularly took a great interest in him and used to come around and watch what he was doing. And he made a dipper out of a tin out of his pack that he'd eat the food out of, and showed this young fellow how to use it to pick up water, and the thing imitated him, and a lot of stuff like that.
Where they held him captive, was that not Mount St. Helens?
Oh, no.
So he was up by
600 or 700 miles away, way north of Baker.
That was a Polish man, I can't remember his name.
No, Swedish. Albert Ostman, Swedish.
Oh, Swedish.
Yeah.
Austin, that is.
Ostman, O-S-T-M-A-N.
OSTA.
And at one time, he wrote this story. What happened was that we'd stirred up a lot of talk about these things with a promotion we were doing at Harrison Hot Springs, strictly tongue-in-cheek. And some of these serious stories started emerging. One well-known woodsman described seeing one 2 years ago and said he didn't know what it was. And this fellow Ostman wrote him a letter and said he did know. He'd seen 4 of them. So the first man phoned Ostman and said he'd like to bring a reporter to talk to him. So Ostman agreed to that, but this was 1957 and this had happened in 24. So to try to remember as much as he could, he sat down and wrote quite a long account of this prospecting trip and all the things he did to get ready and how he went up there and so on. He said trying to get himself back into that, recollecting the things at that time. To me then, at the age of 30, this seemed like a virtually impossible feat of memory, but now that I'm over 60, I realize that things that far back don't seem very far back when you reach this age. But anyway, this story, you see, the very first version of it that appears is a written version, which he gave to me the first time I went to see him. So I had the story and he didn't. It was just written out in a scribbler. Well, then about the third time I went to see him, he suddenly came out with a pile of manuscript about this thick. You know, and I thought, good God, it might be taken in by some frustrated author here. I read through all this stuff and it was just pitiful. It was just hope, all about lonesome loggers and meeting women. And, you know, he couldn't write in the slightest, and yet here he had this fascinating account of this other stuff. Anyway, that's enough about him. Yeah.
You said that there weren't too many things happening where you were now. Is that all along the West Coast, or
Yes.
have things quieted down there?
Well, we're not hearing of anything. That
Because
doesn't say nothing's happening, but we're not hearing of it.
well, they seem to have been picking up more and more around here. Is there any possibility that there's like a migration of what was there
Oh, no.
coming here, or does the slackening off there have anything to do with the picking up here, do you think?
No, if there's, assume for a minute there maybe has been a migration. I'd say they came here from Michigan, because Michigan had a great many reports, say from 7 or 8 years back and for 5 or 6 years before that. But I don't know whether that's what happens. It may be, or whether it just happens that some publicity starts and some people get active and they start digging up information and they publicize and people start contacting them. That's certainly a big part of it. Like when we were getting the most information was in the 10 years after the movie was made. It just kept building up and building up as the movie became better known, and then gradually tapered off again.
Do you think any of them migrate?
Well, that's what we always used to look for, particularly because we have this problem of very few tracks in snow, even though many of the sightings are in places where there's snow for many months. But we've never come up with any evidence of anything you'd really call a migration, maybe a couple of 100 miles. The same footprints have been seen certainly over 100 miles apart in California. That's this one right here, and another one about the same size. This one, by the way, I'm familiar with from 1958. This was cast in 1967, and casts of this same foot have been made as recently as 1984. So this particular individual, or if you prefer it that way, that the foot that these are being faked with has been around that long. But if you're thinking about faking, you can get, I've seen approximately 300 of these in a trail, walking along in the dust in a road under construction. And there's all sorts of toe movement. They're not just made with one thing. Also, that particular trail was made, both of these casts were made from the same time and place. Whether they walked together or whether they walked by, not actually with each other, I don't know. But it was very hot weather, very, very dry. But there had been a brief shower in the evening, the day before that I got down there. And every single one of these tracks, which certainly numbered well over 1,000 of the two kinds originally, because a lot had been wiped out by car traffic before I saw them. Every single one had been made while the ground was still wet, because there was actual little layer of dried mud, making a little hard layer on top of the dust in every single print. So if somebody manufactured them, he manufactured more than 1,000 of them in a period that couldn't have been more than an hour, with, you know, toe movement all over the place. And it's this kind of thing that you know, when you see these tracks and you want to know what made them, you denied an easy explanation. The only easy explanation is there's something with a foot like that walking along there.
What's the size of that cat? The length?
15 inches roughly. And the other one's roughly 13.
What would you say the big one there, give or take, that would weigh, give or take?
If I was guessing on the basis of the prints, I'd have to guess in the tons, and I don't think it weighs tons, so I don't know what the process is.
800 pound or?
Well, look, in another place I've seen that track in hard sand, a sandbar, where I could walk around and not even leave a mark of the sole of my boot. You could trace the whole shape of the heel, but just a little flattening where the sole was. And I jumped off the log about as high as that table and landed as hard as I could on one heel. And I didn't make in the tip of that heel the depth of that whole print. So that's why I say if you're trying to estimate it that way, you're talking tons, and it can't be tons. So I just don't know.
How can you tell the male and female tracks apart?
Can't.
What experience we've had was the males walk in a straight line because the center of gravity is higher, and the females walk a little bit apart because the center of gravity is lower, and that's what we've been told.
Well, but have you seen a male and a female
No, I
walking
haven't.
along to make the track?
No, I haven't.
Well, that's the
But,
problem. And remember that, like, one of the big criticisms of the Patterson film was that it's supposed to be a female, but it walks like a male. But that's saying it walks like a human female. Well, the human female has a very wide pelvis because the human baby has a very fat head. And this is not the case with other higher primates. So one would assume that really, if it walked like a human female, I would assume this would be evidence of fakery. Really, the males and females should be built and walk about the same.
On that tape, how far from town was that Patterson site, from the city?
From the city?
Yeah, or, was that way out in the woods, or?
Oh, yeah.
Was that?
Like, as nearest city is Eureka, right out on the coast, and I guess it's about 50 miles to the smaller town, quite a small town called Willow Creek. And it would be about 35 miles from there. Willow Creek's big enough to have about 3 gas stations and a motel. Well, maybe a little bigger than that. But, and it's 20, I would say roughly 24, 25 miles up a logging road in a creek valley with no inhabitants whatsoever. And going on back into territory that would run maybe another 50 miles before you'd hit any habitation or any road going across the coast.
John, aside from the credibility of it, you dealing with Indians, how far back could they relate accounts of this critter?
Well, they're quite satisfied. They've always been there. Every language group on the coast has a word for them. A great variety of words, because I think it's different back here, but there's 20 or 30 different distinct languages in the Indians along the Pacific coast. As far as I know, every one of them has its own word for these things. And most of them aren't translatable. They're just, the group up in these islands where we went, when they spoke to them in English, they just called them apes. Their own word was something like buckwis or baquis. I can't pronounce them properly. And Sasquatch isn't pronounced properly either. It's not the way they would pronounce it. But one group has what they call the Zunaqua, and they do translate that, and it's the cannibal woman. But it's not cannibalistic on itself, it eats people. So there is some element of that in the Indian traditions. And they are afraid of it. I was once out with a famous grizzly bear hunter, a guy who gets written up in the sports pages every so often, and even in big magazines. He's guided people to some near records and so on. And at that time, he always hunted grizzlies with a 30-30, which is supposed to be near suicidal, but didn't bother him any. But he and I were out there together, and I'm not a hunter, and I grew up in the city, but he was scared. He was sort of leaning on me for assurance, which was really a strange situation. I mean, if a grizzly bear had appeared, I've gotten used to them since. But anyway, they are afraid of them, and yet these things occupy the typical territory of the displaced species. The Indians had all the better areas, and the Sasquatches are up on the hillside. And the only way that I can explain that something that the Indians are afraid of, nevertheless driven out by them, is that these things haven't got the intelligence to communicate and combine. You know, that they're just on their own. And that makes sense if you think about it, because we got this way because of our inadequacy. We had to combine to survive. We had to use weapons to survive. The anthropologists very nicely call them tools, but if you look at them, they're all weapons. And these things, on the other hand, were obviously, you know, they had no need of a fur coat. They're wearing one. From all accounts, they run extremely fast. They're tremendously powerful. Obviously can see in the dark, which is something no other ape does to get way down the line to some of the primitive semi-primates. But about half our information is things that happen in the dark. But we don't see in the dark, so obviously they must be around then a lot more than they are in the daytime. So here's the thing that, you know, is the master of its environment without any need to act in concert. And it's only in the, you know, just a flick of an eye from the point of view of evolution, that when humans have become so dangerous that they really need it more than their own physical endowment. So why would they learn to talk? Why would they learn to use weapons? And although we have quite a few accounts of them throwing, I don't know of any where they threw straight. It's always just a big art.
Are you familiar with the name Ray Wallace?
Very.
We were fortunate enough to see some film reportedly done by Ray Wallace over Alliance, Ohio.
I don't doubt for a second that Ray had made the film. I doubt very much if there was a Sasquatch in it.
You think it was staged?
Yes, all my experience, which goes back 30 years, indicates to me that it would be staged. However, it's just my opinion.
Have you noticed that they've been around excavations, digging a lot? You were mentioning logging roads and...
No, that's not typical. But it does happen, but not a very high percentage of sightings involve anything like that.
We've had a lot of things down here, and my own investigation has been either in old strip mine, old sand pits, or around power lines.
I see. Well, yeah.
It's kind of, you know, typical.
As I said at the beginning, I'm a complete novice as far as what's happening in Ohio.
Pardon me, sir. Do you believe that they have ESP?
No.
You say no?
I say no.
Oh, excuse me.
You think these satellites will help? These satellites they've got now, that they claim they can see a human face through the clouds, certainly they ought to be able to find Bigfoot one of these days.
I think if the resources available to mankind were turned loose on the problem, we could find one in a week. It's just not being done. And, you know, this is what we've always aimed at, is to convince the people that have the money, have the equipment, have the training to go to work on this problem, but it's always left to the amateurs. And then they complain because we don't get results. I think with the sophisticated devices that the Army developed in Vietnam, that they could go and surround an area and just move in and identify everything in it, probably. Genghis Khan used to do that to feed his horde, but I've never been able to get the U.S. Army to do it.
When you were talking about migration or migration routes, in the late 70s and the early 80s, now we got in on that up in Michigan, and we had the Michigan Department of Natural Resources that would let us know when there were things in. It was every June and every October, just like clockwork. We got so we would just go every June and every October, and they thought it was a food source. They were just traveling
Moving from one to another.
From north to south by food source. But
I would expect that kind of movement.
Yeah. But then those places got so, the places were mostly like recreation areas and things like that. They got so filled in with people and opened up, and so they got, the things stopped coming through there. So then that's how we got over to here. Now they don't seem like they have much up there now, and there's things here, but there's not a month that we don't have things. Don can tell you there's every month of the year. So why do you think, do you have any ideas about why they would stay around one place, like around here?
Only that they did have a source of food year-round in the one place.
But Ohio's not that much different than Michigan, is it?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know what it's like out in California, but I can tell you here, there's enough underground caverns and caves and coal mines that you could live down there for 10 years and nobody ever knows it.
We don't think they're using caves in the West for this reason, that there are far more people who explore caves than there are people looking for Sasquatch. And we get absolutely no Sasquatch information from the cave people. But sure, if they're looking for a place to hide in, yeah.
Well, you're not more forested, thickly.
Oh yeah, I mean,
You've got a lot more cover
where I am,
than we
the
have here.
Sasquatches have got 95% of the territory. The people are just in a few valleys. So it's a totally different situation.
Have you drawn any conclusions on how this creature feeds?
Well, look at it this way. Either there is such a thing or there isn't. If there is, then the probability is that most of the people who describe seeing them are describing this as something they actually saw. And that breaks down about 50-50 between animals, fish, and vegetable material. And I'm inclined to think that stories of them eating or stealing a deer that was hung up or this kind of thing would probably travel more than stories of something eating berries. So it's my own just prejudice that probably they're eating mainly vegetable material. And this is taking us into pretty well the diet of a bear. And I would say the lifestyle of a bear fits them fairly well. Doesn't explain some of their, why you see just the males and this kind of thing, but as to what they eat, and I think you've got to assume that they do not have any kind of a home, because if they did, if they had any real patterns, I don't think that we would have failed to come up with them long since. I think it's almost beyond argument that they must have a very erratic lifestyle if you just don't get to know enough about what they're doing to be able to intercept. And when it's pouring rain, they probably just hunker down right where they are, just the way a chimpanzee would do.
Why do you think a dead one hasn't been found?
I cannot give any adequate explanation for that. That's the one reason why it's perfectly sensible to conclude that there's no such thing. I can give lots of explanations as to why it would be rare, but I can't give any explanation that's satisfactory that it would never happen. Our area, the soil is typically acid and bones don't last. And of course, nature has a cleanup squad anyway for bones, otherwise the earth would be buried miles deep in them by this time. And things that are dying tend to get themselves well hidden away. You usually only find bones of something that died violently. But none of this will explain why you never have found them.
Except for roadkills, we don't find dead animals.
Well, I'm sure there's
Of
some
any
hunters
kind.
here, and I think
Do they
that
run?
any of them
do
would
they run
confirm that
across
they
a
don't
lot
very
of-
often find any remains of something that hasn't been shot by somebody or killed by somebody. Just a side note, by the way, I mentioned them living like bears, and you know we all know that a black bear eats meat, but it just digs up the odd rodent and eats up winter kills and stuff like that. Okay, well, just in the last little while, a man studying caribou in Newfoundland, where the black bears are pretty big. There are no grizzlies, and I guess they're moving up into that canyon. Began to wonder why there were always black bears around the caribou, and he started radio collaring black bears as well as caribou. And he discovered that black bears were active predators, that they would overtake and kill caribou and moose. So he started sharing his findings with other people who study black bears across Canada, and they very quickly all agreed that, yeah, this was happening. Now there's something that generations of hunters and Indians too would tell you is nonsense. You put the radio collar on, and he said, well, gee, how stupid can we be? He said, here these things can run like crazy, they've got all this weaponry. Of course they're an active predator. And yet we've always believed they weren't.
We're still just carrying these.
Yeah.
At Ruby Creek, what attracted the Sasquatch to go down to that house?
Well, nobody could say. It's supposed to have dumped out a barrel of salt fish and tried biting a couple, but didn't like them. I hardly think that did it. I just don't know. It's very untypical behavior.
Would you say a Bigfoot will eat humans?
I would say not.
Have you ever heard of the place up in British Columbia called Skullless Valley?
I mean, Headless Valley?
Headless Valley or Skullless? Yeah, Headless Valley.
Then it's in the Hanny Valley, yeah, it's actually...
I know I read stories about that place. They said where there was a dozen hunters and trappers, they found their bodies but no heads. And they said a Bigfoot has been seen already carrying a human head under, and it was chewing on the nose and the ears. Say that's a delicacy to them.
Well, the Hanny Valley has been the location of a lot of very colorful legends. There are hot springs in there, and there's supposed to be dinosaurs living around the hot spring and so like that. But in fact, it's been traveled and trapped just like any other valley. And there was indeed a case where some people were found dead in their sleeping bags without their heads, and that's why it's called Headless Valley. But nobody has I've never heard the story of one carrying a human head. It's new one to me. Certainly some of the Indians believed that they ate people, there's no question about that. And it's quite possible that this did happen, but what you have to look at is that if these things are here, they're all over the place. I mean, you've got ample evidence that they're in Ohio. And it's always been considered perfectly safe to wander around in the woods in North America without a gun. And if these things are there, they've been there all along. So the menace in the woods is no greater than when you start toying with the idea that maybe these things are there. It's no greater than it was the day before. The other animals aren't dangerous, and these aren't dangerous either. Otherwise, there'd be an awful lot more people that would come back. Now, I'm not saying that no Sasquatch ever killed a human. I think it's quite plain that it once set out to kill a human, it could do it very easily, and that the human wouldn't be around to tell about it. So it may have happened. But, and as we all know, other animals have occasionally killed humans. Lots of them are capable of doing it, and On very rare occasions, it does happen, but it's the same with these as with anything else. One thing I'm really unhappy about is that we have, for a lot of people, created a boogeyman and that they're scared by it. And there's no reason for that at all. There's no evidence you're in danger with these things around. Either they're not there or else they don't bother you, one or the other.
John, has the Canadian government posed an evasive position for any kind of opinion, either through the media or other, that this government has? In other words, our USA government is evasive. The media is evasive. They are evasive to the point that the more educated they are, the less believers there are.
When I got into this, my father was the Canadian Secretary of State. I can assure you that the Canadian government has never given 30 seconds thought to this question. What I would really like, see, we have all this evidence, and you try to present it to scientists, it doesn't mean anything to them. They don't deal with that kind of thing. What I would really like is what we call a royal commission, or perhaps the equivalent here would be a congressional committee hearings. That we could bring these witnesses before judges and have them questioned by lawyers. Because this is the kind of evidence that we have. And this kind of evidence is taken seriously by that kind of people. You know, they hang people on this kind of evidence. And moreover, this kind of people also run the country and decide what the money gets spent on. So that if you could convince a congressional investigation that this thing is there and should be investigated, they could appropriate the money, and I assure you the scientists would be happy to look for it. You know, but what does happen is that if somebody takes an interest, some zoologist or something, okay, he goes to the head of the department, and the head of the department says, don't touch it. Or if the head of the department is the least bit encouraging and it goes in and up to the whatever you have here, the Senate or whoever's running the university, I mean, the guy's just hurting his own reputation to bring it up. So it just never happens. And as for the Smithsonian, they put out some of the damnedest crap in explaining this away. I've even seen a release of theirs describing the Patterson movie as an 8mm movie. That's how much they know about it. Although it was taken there and shown to them right in the beginning. You know, they know there's no such thing. Therefore, anything that tends to show that there is fakery, and they're not going to get mixed up with it. It's a beautiful circular argument.
If you brought one in, they probably wouldn't believe it, would they?
Well, it's long been a fantasy in the Sasquatch business that we'll get one alive, and we'll invite all the scientists we've ever dealt with to come and see it. And we're going to put them all up on about the 8th floor in a great big room, and then we'll just open the door, shove them in, and say, here you are, have a look.
And slam the door.
And slam the door.
All yours.
Oh, yeah. Wait, I tell you, there is something happening that might get through to them. Because what you have to realize that zoologists nowadays, there are a few of them out there studying animal behavior. But mostly they're doing their zoology through a microscope. And you know, to try to talk to them about a brand new great big animal, it's not the thing they're doing. Even, you know, way back 25 years ago, I was trying to talk the head of a zoology department and take some interest, and he went out of the room for some reason. I'm just standing there, and on the desk in front of me is a letter from a guy applying for a job. And he describes where he got his PhD, and he says his field is the respiratory system of the goldfish and the tank. And that's his life work. You know, and are you going to talk to him about Sasquatches? Okay, but one of the things that is on the cutting edge is the identification of proteins. And they are, by more than one technique, approaching, and by one technique they may already have arrived at the point where they can take the tiniest bit of protein and identify it positively to the point where they're claiming to identify the blood stains on prehistoric weapons. See, this is deer blood on this one and human blood on that one. And if they can do it with the technique that has reached that point works only with water-soluble protein. And unfortunately, hair is not water-soluble. But there is a little bit of protein on hair, or maybe in the medulla of it, that is water-soluble. And we have reached the point where one of the top men in this field has done this work on a process called radioimmunoassay. I won't go into it. Sounds like a Rube Goldberg deal, but it's supposed to be very accurate. And he has taken hair that Bob Titmus collected one hair at a time off trees in Northern California, which he thought had been broken off by Sasquatch. And he ground them up, dissolved out what protein he could, and he says this hair is either human, gorilla, or chimpanzee. Now, he doesn't know from nothing about hair, because most of this hair was wool hair, and humans don't have it. And anyway, human hair doesn't taper. It grows continuously and gets cut off square. So this human hair is just laughable. So that leaves us with gorillas or chimpanzees leaving their hairs one at a time on trees in Northern California. And as a matter of fact, I don't believe they would have very many, if any, wool hairs either, being tropical animals. And Bob himself is a taxidermist and has mounted both gorillas and chimpanzees, and he says no way it resembles either one. But the guy ground up the entire sample. So what we have to do is get him another sample of the same and say, look, just save a few. And when if you get the same result again, then under your own control, take the remaining hairs to someone who does hair identification with a comparison microscope. And instead of being faced with taking the suspected Sasquatch hair and comparing it with every other hair in the world, he's just got to do 3, and it shouldn't take him more than a few minutes. And if then someone of equal expertise in his own field says to this man, okay, the hairs you've saved out of here are not human, chimpanzee, or gorilla, then he's faced with saying, I have identified proteins from a higher primate that is not known. So we may be right on the verge of that. We may have that by this summer. On the other hand, it may prove to be another dead end. We do have more hair. From the same sample was sent to another man. We haven't got away from him and to this other fellow yet. Everybody run down?
Oh, you know what, I was thinking, you were talking about a commission to study this. What did you call that?
Canada, we call a royal commission.
Yeah.
They appoint a judge or 3 judges.
So you get, no, I mean, so you get money to do this, and you get somebody to go at it in an official way, and go out and get this thing established. Then if they cut the feet off of elephants and just for, what do they make, ashtrays, and they take the horns off of them, they kill all these animals just for something like that. So they establish that this Bigfoot is really an animal. Then the people with money are going to want a Bigfoot rug. I mean...
yeah, you're quite right. They will want one. It'll be up to government to see to it they don't get one.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're not the Congo. We should be able to enforce these things. The other side of that picture is that if we are harming them in any way, it's by destroying their habitat. And if you know any way to hold off the real estate industry in the name of an imaginary animal, I don't. But if you prove they were there, then maybe you could get some pretty big areas set aside. I am, because as I said, they've got 95% of the country to themselves anyway. Yeah. But in Florida, it's the exact opposite. There used to be lots of reports out of Florida. There are still some, but if they're in Florida, I'd expect they will be wiped out within very few years. But not by shooting them, just by paving over the swamp and they're gone. Yeah.
A few years ago, there was an incident at Washington State, where a ranger or something seen a preacher. Are you familiar with that incident?
Kind of a ranger.
He was supposedly a seen a preacher, and
A forest ranger or a...
I think he did.
Oh, okay. You're talking about Paul Freeman. Yeah, it's not that simple. Paul, I think, just an opinion, that Paul probably did see a Sasquatch and would have been wiser to keep his mouth shut, as far as this job is concerned. But since that time, Paul is seeing tracks with remarkable frequency. And just recently, he and his son claimed to get a picture of one. And well, I'm 6'3", and the first day I met Paul, he told me he was 6'5", and I couldn't quite figure out why I was looking down at him. And he's just one of these guys that you don't really have any way of knowing whether he ever met the truth. So, well, people like that can see Sasquatches, sure, that you know. So. And as I say, I think he probably did see the first one, but I think he liked the attention, even though he lost his job. But I don't think that's the only reason he lost his job. He doesn't have a history of holding jobs before or since. I guess I'm wiser to sit down.
Okay.
I've seen a lot of change, been through a lot of pain. Some things are not the same as they were a year ago, but all will be okay. I move on each and every day. The past is where it stays, way back a year ago.